Hi everybody. So today I'm going to be talking about polar bears and climate change. I'll be specifically talking about food chains, nutrient cycling, population cycles, and the growth curves of polar bears. So before we get started, let's go over some fun facts about polar bears. So the first is that polar bears have an excellent sense of smell and can locate seals from up to 40 miles away. Being the incredible hunters that they are, polar bears can swim up to 100 miles at a time. And although they can reach weights of 1,540 pounds, polar bears are actually born very small. They weigh about 1 pound and are 1 foot long. So now we're going to be talking about population cycles. In 2005, polar bears became the first species on Earth to be declared threatened because of climate change. However, this classification had nothing to do with population changes. As you'll see later, polar bear populations have actually been increasing since 1950. The first reason for this increase is because of anti-polar bear hunting laws that were passed in the 1970s. The Multilateral Conservation of Polar Bears Agreement of 1970 limited polar bear hunting in Greenland, America, Russia, Canada, and Norway, all northern habitats for polar bears. However, the effects of restricting of hunting are starting to wear off, and the effects of global warming are starting to arise. With melting ice in northern Arctic habitats caused by increasing Arctic temperatures, polar bears now have to swim farther to catch seals and are often outswam when they do try to catch them. This decrease in food availability has led to a smaller birth rate for polar bears, meaning that the current generation will produce less offspring than the one before them. These reasons represent the predicted fall and extinction of polar bears. So in our first graph regarding polar bear populations, we see that around the world, polar bear populations have actually been increasing since 1950. And this increase was due, as I said in the last slide, was due mainly because of a decrease in hunting of polar bears. However, as I said earlier, the effects of this hunting are starting to wear off, and in these 4 regions around the world, polar bear populations are already starting to and are expected to decline and then eventually be extinct. Just to prove that sea ice is actually melting, we have this graph here that starts in 1880 and then shows average Arctic temperatures starting all the way in 1880, moving from about -1 Celsius all the way to more than 1 Celsius today. And this is caused by environmental effects that I will explain in the later slide. So now I'm going to be talking about the food chains and webs of polar bears. Climate change is not only directly affecting polar bears, it is also directly affecting the animals below it on the food web. With climate change, the ice in the Arctic is slowly melting, which in turn is decreasing the hunting season for polar bears. Polar bears rely on cold climate and ice to hunt prey, most notably the ringed and bearded seal populations. With melting ice, polar bears have to swim farther, making it harder for polar bears to catch seals. Polar bears need to hunt during the colder months of the year to save energy and food in the warmer months. Because of this decrease in food, female polar bears are now having a harder time having successful pregnancies, which is resulting in a smaller future polar bear population. Ice is the most important part of the polar bear's ecosystem because it helps nourish not only the polar bears, but also the seals and fish and plankton which the seals eat. With oil spills and toxic pollution, the populations of organisms below seals on the food chain is being decreased, which is resulting in less seals for the polar bears to eat. So now we're going to be talking about the primary productivity of polar bears and the food webs that they're involved in. Primary productivity is the transformation of sunlight into physical plants. Biomass in the Arctic Ocean, or phytoplankton, form the basis of life. From there, energy is transferred between one consumer and the next. At every level of the food chain, 90% of the energy is lost as it travels from producer to consumer to consumer. The seal-eating polar bears rely indirectly on how productive the ocean is. The ocean can grow more phytoplankton when more sunlight is available to reach the water. Due to climate change and decreasing amounts of ice coverage, phytoplankton primary production in the Arctic Ocean increased approximately 20% from 1998 to 2009. Theoretically, the more phytoplankton that is produced, the more that polar bears can survive further up on the food chain. Although the general consensus seems to be that polar bear hunting should be restricted, there are many different types of people who actually want to keep hunting polar bears, such as the Native Alaskan peoples. According to legislation from the U.S. Department of the Interior passed in January 2001, Native Alaskans, specifically Indians, Inuits, and Eskimos, are still allowed to hunt up to 500 polar bears a year. However, these native peoples do not waste any part of the polar bear. They use the fur to create shoes and coats, and both eat and savor all of the meat. Because of its prowess and usefulness, polar bears are seen as the most prized and hallowed catch for the native peoples. Native peoples treat captured polar bears with immense respect by offering the spirit hunting tools that the polar bear must use in order to pass on to the afterlife. Native peoples are also unaware of the potential extinction of polar bears because as ice melts, polar bears are forced to move inland towards where the natives are living. So as far as they are concerned, they are actually seeing more polar bears to hunt, and the hunting of polar bears is not an issue. So now we're going to be talking about polar bears and climate change through the eyes of an environmental scientist. So the summers have been becoming increasingly hotter and the ice is beginning to melt earlier and produce later. Polar bears are directly affected by the situation as their hunting season is noticeably shortened. Greenhouse gases that protect our world like a blanket have increased over the last 200 years. Because of the burning of fossil fuels like oil and coal, a basic second shroud of gases has covered the Earth, increasing the temperature. Sea ice losses in 2012 have broken all previous records due to the fact that people are not doing enough to reverse the effects of climate change. Humans have put forth such actions towards the Earth that it would take roughly 30 to 40 years to reverse the effects that have already been taken. If humans do not get their act together, the world will see a mostly ice-free Arctic summer and as soon as 2040. Without ice, polar bears are unable to hunt. This is seen especially in the western Hudson Bay, where because of shortages of ice, populations of polar bears have decreased by 22% since the 1980s. The decrease of ice is leading polar bears to change their diet. This diet is not what it used to be 40 years ago. Today, polar bears are increasingly modifying their diet to prey on caribou and snow geese, as well as their eggs. Climate change is a real human problem that must be taken care of by humans. Now, we will be talking about polar bears and climate change from the perspective of a political activist, specifically former U.S. Vice President Al Gore. In his movie, An Inconvenient Truth, Gore's main argument is that climate change is what is causing the extreme weather conditions and disasters that have been occurring in the last 20 years. The main cause of these changes in weather are rising CO2 levels in the atmosphere. In this graph, we see that CO2 levels have risen dramatically since 1950, which actually starts there. Gore claims in his movie that CO2 is warming the Earth's blanket as more gas collects in our atmosphere. This rise in temperature in turn melts Arctic ice and eats away at polar bear habitats and hunting grounds. Although polar bears are not normally the victims of natural disasters caused by increased CO2 in the atmosphere, their prey, such as seals, reindeer, and seabirds, are. Gore and other environmental activists believe that humans are the main cause of the potential decline in polar bear populations and that they must be the ones to reduce carbon footprint. So now we're going to be looking at polar bears and climate change through the eyes of an environmentalist skeptic. Political radio personality Rush Limbaugh does not believe in man-made climate change. He says, if you believe in God, you cannot believe in man-made global warming. He is against the notions that humans are destroying the Earth. He also explains that we are no different from any other life form, such as mice or rats. However, 97% of scientists are in agreement that climate change is affected by people. Someone with Limbaugh's point of view could easily prove that man-made climate change is not affecting the polar bears. There has not been a decrease in polar bear population, which is an idea that a climate change skeptic could use to go along with the idea that the pollution we create is not endangering polar bears. Limbaugh and other conservative reporters would not take away natives' rights to hunt polar bears and would certainly not support the Foundation's attempt to save this Arctic animal. The first solution to climate change is to limit carbon emissions. The new version of the Clean Air Act in 2011 required the EPA to regulate the sources of air pollution from mobile and sanitary locations. This act reduces the amount of CO2 waste products that are released into the atmosphere. However, most CO2 emissions are coming from large companies, which are focused on making the best product at the lowest price. This takes a toll on their CO2 emissions, which takes a toll on polar bear habitats. However, most states have started to regulate the amount of CO2 emissions that a facility is allowed to release, and this has started to help reduce CO2 emissions, but this is not nearly enough. Every individual must change his or her environmentally detrimental habits in order to save Arctic climates, but there are many ways to do that. Individuals can avoid buying products with a lot of packaging, reducing water consumption, and using either public transportation or carpool. Thank you for watching, and remember that polar bear populations can only be saved by individuals, so always remember to be environmentally conscious. Thank you.